All right, well, welcome to week 4 of our Romans class as we're going through the book of Romans, especially with the focus on the first 8 chapters. This is our second week in exile, recording digitally and planning to post the video. So again, we do miss being able to be together, and it would be best if we had a group for discussion, but instead what we will try to do is make up for that loss by Pastor Ben being as funny as possible. You want to say anything to that? Okay. What I'd like to do at the beginning is first to say, if you have not checked out Pastor Ben's class, the Tower of Babel has free Wi-Fi. That should be uploaded soon. There's 2 weeks of it now that will be online. I recommend it. It's very interesting, both weeks, but particularly this week I found just very helpful and alarming. So it was a good
That's what we're
class.
going for. Yeah.
Alarmism.
General alarm. We need more of that these days.
Yeah. So maybe don't if you're feeling a little too anxious. But we're going to be diving into Romans chapter 2 today. And what I want to do is I want to give just a few comments about some ideas that are going to be important as we dive into chapter 2. And then I want to kind of sum up some things we didn't get to cover from the end of chapter 1. Then we're going to actually dive into the passage, Romans 2. There is zero chance we'll get all the way through it. I may add a summary of it either at the end of this week of what we don't get through. I may add a summary of what we don't get through either at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. So, to start with, I wanted to talk about the Jewish view of God's judgment because Romans chapter 2 focuses heavily on God's judgment. And when Paul was writing, he was writing again, remember, to Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. And the Jewish Christians had their own view of what God's judgment was going to be like. The Old Testament talks about God's judgment. The term, the day of the Lord, is one that you hear a lot through the Old Testament. And it refers to this day where God is going to come and end things or change things or transition things into a new messianic age. And so the judgment of God was something that the Jewish people were already very familiar with. The judgment of God is something that can be very uncomfortable for us to kind of reconcile with because we like to think of God as a good and loving God. And it's hard, and He is a good and loving God. And so it's hard for us to reconcile that with the idea of a God who judges. If you're a person who is oppressed or suffering, as God's people were for the entirety of the time through the Old Testament, for the most part, and we're still in that place of suffering from oppression when Jesus came, then God's judgment on those who abuse power, who are corrupt, who do harm to weaker ones, is a promise that brings joy and hope. It's a promise of deliverance and salvation. And so we need to remember that because we tend to read it from our own perspective, where we are in the 21st century in the West, and we are the ones in power as far as like the status of America in the world today. We need to remember that that's not the way that most of God's people have experienced life throughout the history of the church. And that God's judgment is a wonderful promise to those who are in need of rescue. Okay. I also want to, and we talked about this in the in-person part of this class, but I want to talk a little bit about what the word justice means in the Old Testament. In Hebrew, the words for justice and righteousness are the same word. And those concepts are just very different than what we think of when we think of justice today. When we think of justice, we have kind of this Western view where justice means that the punishment must fit the crime, right? And so if you break my window, then you must pay for that. If you commit a crime, then whatever punishment befalls you must be appropriate for the crime you've committed. That's kind of our view of justice. The view of God's justice was different. When the promise of God's justice or His righteousness, His making things right, was heard in the Old Testament, the promise there is that He would return things to the way they were always supposed to be. So if your window gets broken, justice in the Old Testament, the picture there is that the window gets remade, right? if someone is killed, the promise of God's justice is that that person will be returned to life. That's the big picture. And so this promise of God coming and bringing his justice and righteousness at the end was a promise of a restoring the world to the way it was supposed to be. So those who corruptly used power to oppress those who were weaker would meet their comeuppance there. But in that way, it would be because the world was going to be set to rights, where people were not going to be able to behave in that way toward each other any longer. One of the things that the Apostle Paul is doing in the book of Romans is something called diatribe. Now, when we hear the word diatribe today, we think of a person giving kind of a long-winded rant, right? Or maybe a diatribe is something that you give to someone who isn't even there, right? It's kind of a form of venting while you're alone. But in the ancient world, diatribe was a very specific form of argument where you imagined that your opponent was present, and you imagined the kind of things they would say back or the points they would make, and you overcome their objections as you're speaking. And the point of the diatribe is not for the person the pretend person you're arguing for. It's kind of for the audience who's listening in. And that's actually what we are. As Paul's having this imaginary argument with two opponents, we are kind of the audience getting to listen in. So I want to dive in here, but I want to start by summing up the end of chapter 1, and really just with the last verse. Verse 32 in chapter 1, Paul has just listed this long list of things that are vices, that are bad, that are examples of injustice or unrighteousness. Gossip and slander and God-hating and insolence. And the list is long, but then in verse 32 he says this: although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. Paul is saying that the very worst, kind of the capstone on the list of injustices or unrighteousness, is to look at a thing that you know is evil and call it good. Or look at a thing that you know is good and call it evil. He's saying that's kind of the worst of the worst. That's going to matter as we move into chapter 2. Well, as we begin diving into chapter 2, a few of the things that I want you to know is that what's happening here is Paul is speaking to his opponents, right, in this diatribe, in this argument, the kind of pagan who views himself as a very good person, or a Gentile who views himself as a very good person, who is not a Christian. And at the same time, this non-Christian Jewish person. He's having this argument with them. And both of them would consider themselves above that list of injustices at the end of chapter 1. And what he's saying here is that God's judgment is going to leave everybody without excuse. You don't actually get to say that you're better than the people who do those things. All of us are in the same boat. But the focus here isn't mostly on whether or not people are sinners. It's about God putting things right. It's about his justice or his righteousness. So I want to dive into chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? So that word right at the beginning, therefore, whenever you see that, especially in Paul, he's connecting thoughts, right? The thought he's giving now is connected to the one that he just gave a moment. And he's not saying that his opponents would have done this long list of unrighteousness, but he is saying that last thing, that capstone, to look at a thing that is bad and call it good, or to look at a thing that is good and call it evil. He is saying that they are guilty of that when they have looked at other people and seen themselves as better than them. Actually, since we are all in the same state before a just God, to elevate ourselves that way makes us or demonstrates that we are guilty of sin. So since they've held themselves up as better than other people, they're actually just as guilty as those other people. Pastor Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think it puts me in mind of a lot of, things that Jesus says. So when he talks about, the man born blind in John chapter 9, and how there's a deeper and greater blindness that the Pharisees and the religious leaders are displaying, or the parable in Luke with the tax collector and the Pharisee, and the Pharisee's whole sense of his situation before God is that he's glad he's not like that other man, the tax collector, and yet it's the tax collector who goes home justified, right? And there's that word again, justified before God. And I think it's, that so much of what people do in our religion and everything else is that we just define ourselves over against other people, right? And as long as I'm, if you ask an average American today, like, do you think that you're a bad person, right? And the answer is, well, no, and then they'll come up with examples of people who are really bad, right? And they're right, as far as it goes. Sure, you're not as bad as whatever, a murderer, or these other things. But that's the wrong scale, to be judging on. And I think that one of the most important aspects of kind of what Paul is trying to convey to the Romans, and even what part of the proclamation of the gospel is that God's way of judging is different than ours. And so you live your life thinking, oh yeah, I'm a good person because of this thing and that thing, and then to be told, actually, the judge has an entirely different way of thinking about this, and that should give everybody pause, oh, so am I a good person, it just give everybody pause in terms of trying to sort one another, into different camps, and I think especially with the idea that sometimes I think we can struggle in how we think of the difference between saved people and unsaved people, right? Or people in the church and people outside the church, and how we're better, because we're saved, we're better than they are, and just how ridiculous that thought really is. When you think about it, there's a ship has gone down and there's all these people drowning in the ocean, and a dozen of them have been pulled aboard the lifeboat, right? And then they sit there going, ha! We're better than those bozos drowning in the water, and it's just what are you talking about? That's just not what's happening. That's just not the situation, that those people are in. And so I think, it's the same with us, of either pagan, upright pagan people or upright Jewish people, kind of making these claims about who's good and who's not. And Paul's saying, guys, look, this is just completely wrong. We're all drowning in the ocean, anyway. And so
one of the things that's interesting here, and this as we move into verses 4 to 6, that's important, is one of the common Jewish thoughts at the time was that while the Jewish people weren't perfect, because they had God's law, because they were his special chosen people, their sins were so much less than Gentile sins. And so the things they did wrong did not matter nearly as much as the things that Gentile people did. And so Paul says in verses 4 to 6, do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. So that idea of Jewish people feeling like their sins didn't matter because they were God's people is wrong. And as a side note, the way that Christians can sometimes excuse their own behavior or the behavior of other Christians because at least they're Christians and that makes them better than those that are on the outside is completely absurd and thoroughly unacceptable. It is absolutely wrong to think that your status as a part of our faith makes you in some way better than the people around you, because that's absolutely not true. And that's what Paul says here. He says that doesn't work. This quote, will you not repay everyone according to what they have done? That's from Psalm 62:12 and Proverbs 24:12. That was this this idea that was already present in the Old Testament, that God's going to repay each person according to what they've done. And that's actually a picture of the judgment. And this is one of the things that's hardest about Paul's view of God's judgment, is that he's absolutely talking about a judgment based on works. He's absolutely talking about a judgment based on your goodness or your lack thereof. Now, we can get stuck here and say, wait a second, Paul's not saying that there's a salvation by works. You're right, he's not. He's going to explain how even though we're incapable of living up to the vision that God or what God has called us to, we are saved in a very specific way. He is talking about God's judgment coming for those that have not lived up to what they were supposed to live up to, that have succumbed to sin versus those that have done righteousness. And the problem is, since no one is perfect, then everybody falls under the view of God's judgment. All right, so I want to dive in now to verses 7 to 11. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, and then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. One of the things that the Apostle Paul has been constantly talking about is God's lack of favoritism for Gentiles or for Jews. And we see that clearly here. His judgment will be fair. But what's really interesting about this is he doesn't say that who by persistence in doing good and then list a list of things that they've done. He talks about their seeking. They seek glory, honor, and immortality. But those who are self-seeking, right? And so the idea isn't so much about what's been accomplished, it's about what the heart position has been. And that's very strange for the Apostle Paul to kind of change the Jewish view, because the Jewish view at the time, when a rabbi would be talking about this, there'd come a list of things that they've done or not done, right? And so if you've done these things, then you end up in the good camp. And if you've done these things, you end up in the bad camp. Paul's talking instead about a disposition of the heart. So there's also this piece that's tense here, because God's impartial, right? But what happens when his role as a good judge, right, in a law court, conflicts with his covenant promises to Israel? So what if Israel's actually guilty, but God has made promises to them about what he's going to do with and through them, right? So what if they are judged guilty, but he's promised them good things? Like, how is that going to be resolved? Well, we don't see that in chapter 2, but we do find out in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 all the way into chapter 4, that this is going to be a matter of faith, that the doing of the law, which is what Paul is very what Paul finds very important, more important than hearing the law, is done by faith. And we're kind of getting the beginning of that, or the hint of that, here in chapter 2. So then verses 12 to 16. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So one of the things that's hard is the Apostle Paul wanted to communicate that the Torah is good, right? So he did not want us to come to see the Old Testament as bad. And that is a flaw that a lot of Christians have. We tend to think of the Torah, the covenant, the old covenant is bad in some way, and it's not. It was good. And Paul never wants to communicate anything different. But at the same time, he has to find a way to, or he believes that you are not less if you're not under it. So the Torah is good, but it's not binding. And he's kind of showing how that works here in verses 12 to 16. So in verse 12, he's kind of responding to an objection from one of the people he's arguing with, who might say, at least we have the Torah. That makes us better than the Gentiles. And the Apostle Paul says, well, no, all who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law. So if they don't have the Torah, they'll sin apart from the Torah. But those of you who have the Torah and don't keep it will perish or be judged by the Torah, by the law. So it's not a matter of having the Old Testament makes you less likely to receive God's judgment. If you have it, you'll be judged by it, and if you don't have it, you'll be judged apart from it. And then in verse 13, Paul says that it's doing, not having or hearing the Torah, that matters. And you fast forward to Romans 8, where Paul says there's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, right? And he goes on to talk about how the requirements of the law are fulfilled by the faith that we have in Christ. In other words, Christians are fulfilling the law even though they didn't receive it like a Jewish person did. And so what he's saying here is that what really matters is not hearing the Torah like a Jewish person does for their whole life. He's saying what really matters is fulfilling the Torah, and there's only one way to really do that, to really satisfy the law, and that's by having faith in Jesus and being indwelt by the Spirit. So if you want to really fulfill the Torah, Paul is saying, what matters is whether or not you're a Christian, not whether or not you're a Jew. And then in verses 14 and 15, there's this question that comes up around these verses. I'm going to read them again really quickly. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they're a law for themselves, even though they don't have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. A lot of people wonder, who is Paul talking about here? And there's disagreement among Christian teachers. I'm going to tell you what I think. The people that Paul is talking about here aren't Gentile non-Christians. I think he's talking about Gentile believers, right? So who do not have the law by nature, meaning that they weren't taught the law as children, right? They didn't go to synagogue and kind of take it in. Instead, the law is written on their hearts, which is what the Old Testament promises will happen in the New Covenant. So he's saying Gentile Christians who didn't grow up with the law like Jewish people did, they've still got the law written on their hearts. And that's a really important piece here, because what he's saying is that it's not like they don't have access to the law, or that somehow a Jewish person is better for having the law, because these Gentile Christians have the law written on their hearts, as was promised in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah and in the book of Ezekiel. And so, let's see here. Then there's this question, because it says in verse 15, it says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences bearing witness, their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. It's like Paul is saying that at judgment, there's this kind of confusion that happens. Did they follow the law, or did they not follow the law? What's happening is Paul saying that they've sought after these things, these good things that we saw earlier you're supposed to seek after, not necessarily to do. But since they haven't perfectly obeyed every law in the Old Testament, there's this like confusion about whether or not they've fulfilled the requirements of the law. And he's saying absolutely they have. If they have faith in Jesus, they've fulfilled the law. But Pastor Ben.
Well, I think that, we're reading this as Gentiles, and so...
You're not a Jew?
No, I'm not a Jew. So we're reading this as Gentiles, and it puts me in mind of kind of our sermon series last fall and looking through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And one of the things that I think we discovered, Clayton and I, kind of really seriously studying Leviticus, and I think it's there for the learning. I don't think it's a secret, but that I think maybe there's two concepts. One, and this is something that the church has taught for a long time, that the law that God gave on Sinai, the Torah, in one way, it is a specific covenant agreement with the people of Israel, which means that nobody else is bound to do those things because it's only the covenant with Israel. At the same time, the Torah is connected to or in relation to what I guess philosophers would call like the universal moral law, right? So it's wrong for Israelites to murder, both because it's in the covenant for them not to do that, and because it's wrong for anybody to murder at any time, right? Whereas it's not wrong for Joe Schmo Canaanite to enjoy a dinner of shrimp, even though it would have been wrong and a violation of the covenant for the Israelites to do so, right? So there's kind of that tension back and forth. And I think that's part of what Paul's saying here as well, is that the Torah is in relation to or is connected to kind of a universal moral law that everybody on the planet, every human being has access to through our conscience. Then I think there's also the sense in which we know that the specific laws of the covenant of the Torah, the Israelites were expected to obey them, but they weren't just expected to obey them just to obey them, right? I think that's where this whole, the upright Jew, that's where he's sitting is, well, I obeyed all these things, and I think that Jesus would say, okay, awesome, so like you did all these things, but like if you hate people, or like if you've completely missed the whole point, right? I think about like the food laws especially. Like the point of the food laws was not, look at me, I'm clean, I'm better than them because I didn't eat these bad things. The point of the food laws was to give the Israelites a way to live in life, right? And to not be associated with death, and to think about the fact that Yahweh, the Creator, is on the side of life every time they ate a meal, right? Like that was the point. It was not, these other things. Or the Sabbath, right? I mean, I think the reason why Jesus crashes against like the Sabbath commandments all the time is because he's saying, folks, you've completely missed, like the Sabbath is about delight and joy and dwelling in God's good world, not sitting in your homes worried that if you take too long of a walk, you're going to have to die because you violated this. It wasn't about constricting and chaining up, I think, human souls and human lives. So the law is for life. And so I think that idea as well, that when the Holy Spirit comes and indwells a person, you are living in the fullness of life that Jesus has brought, which was the point of the Torah all along, but that the fullness of life cannot be had by meticulously trying to obey all of the laws just so that you can say you have checked all the boxes and obeyed all the laws.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as you were talking, I was thinking about 1 Corinthians 13, a passage that says, if I give all I possess to the poor, but have not love, I gain nothing, right? The point isn't the things that you've done. It's the relationship with God and the transformation that's supposed to happen because of it that's behind all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are you recording already?
Yes, I was hoping you'd say something funny when you walked in.
Oh.
Perform, Ben, perform. That'll stand.